This video is going to cover creating the direct messages portion of the Chatroom application. Now, in the previous tutorial, we created the application on the right, as you can see here, which has a list of chat rooms that you can move between and talk to whoever is in that chat room with. Where we stopped was the ability to click on one of these users and direct message them. For example, I can't click on john@doe.com, otherwise I get an error. On the left here, we have the current version of the application as I've been building it out for these tutorials. So you'll see some new stuff like the icons and the timestamps. But the thing I want to focus on is these chat windows with one specific user. So here I'm talking to specifically Jane, and here I have a conversation with slack@example.com, and like John and test case or whatever. And I can still go over to the general chats as well if I'd like to, or any of the other chats. What we're going to focus on is just these direct messages for this video. And if you'd like to see these other features, feel free to leave a comment down below. I'll cover anything from the profile pictures to making this an Electron application moving forward. So if you have any other suggestions, please let me know. Now, the first thing that I'd like to get started with here is creating the user's controller that allows us to show an individual user. For this, I'll go ahead and I'll stop my server. I've moved everything into episodes. So you'll see a GitHub repository down below that has each episode's source code inside of a separate folder. But what we're going to do is we're just going to run a Rails G controller. We're going to generate a user's controller, and we're just going to give it a show action. So we'll go ahead, we'll hit enter on that, and then we can clear our console. Now we need to actually go into that controller. So let's go ahead and let's open up app, controllers, and our user's controller. Now inside of this show method, we need to do a couple things. The first thing we want to do is grab the @user, which is just going to be user.find with a params of ID. We then need to grab the @users, which is going to be equal to user.all except the current user. And if you'll recall from episode 1, we created a helper method in our user model, and that was the scope right here that has all except, which is just us searching for any user that isn't the current user. So that's how we're grabbing that specific, exclusion of the current user here. So this isn't a default method. It's something we had to build out with the scope. But okay, we have our user and our users. GitHub Copilot thinks we're making Wall Street bets, so it's suggesting us to grab some stocks. We don't have those, but what we do have are rooms. So let's start with a @room equals room.new. .new. Then let's grab the @rooms, which is equal to room.public_rooms. And of course, that's just the list of rooms right here. So these are considered public rooms with how we've set up everything. After we grab the rooms, we then want to grab the room name. So I'm going to say @room_name, which is equal to get name. And then we'll pass in the @user and the current user. Now this get name method doesn't exist yet. So of course we have to go define it. So let's create a private area. Let's do a def get name, and then let's just pass in user1 and user2. The way this is going to work is we want to create a unique name for this combination, which is going to contain both the user we're talking to as well as ourselves. So we'll just combine the user IDs. Now there's two ways to do it. Copilot here is suggesting this if statement, but there's a cleaner way, which is just user equals, and then an array with user1, user2, and then we just call .sort. We actually don't need the rest of that. Next, we just create a string. We say private underscore, and then we can do a hash symbol with some braces, throw some actual code in here, and we'll just grab the user's 0.id, and we'll do an underscore, and then the user1.id. So we're sorting these first to make sure that we get the same order of string depending on which user is entering the conversation so that we get the same conversation. Because for example, if John was trying to message me, he would then be user1, I would be user2, which would flip this string right here. So the name of the room would be backwards and you would have a different conversation depending on who you were in the conversation, which is very confusing. But just follow along with this, I guess it'll make sense if you start looking at the room names in the Rails console. So we have our @room. We now need to do our @single_room, which of course is going to be a little bit messier. So let me full screen this. We'll start with a room.where. And here we can just say the name is the @room name that we just grabbed with our method. And we'll call .first. And if we don't have a room name, we then need to, well, of course, make one. And to do this, we can call room.create private room. And then we'll have to pass in some stuff that has gone off the screen on my other monitor. So what we want to pass in here is the @user. And we want to pass in the current user. And then we need to pass in the @room name. So now that we have all of that, we of course don't have a create private room as far as I'm aware, so we'll have to make that. But let's finish up in our controller first. So let's say @message is equal to message.new. Then we can say @messages is equal to @single_room. So depending on what we grabbed here, this is either our general chat or it's the messages that we grabbed from our private chat. And we can say @single_room.messages.order. And we want to order these by created at. And we want to say ascending order. That way we get the messages with the newest message at the bottom. And then after all of that, let's just do a render rooms/index. And we can save this, and this should be good. We will have to come back in here later for a future tutorial, but I think we're done in this file for now. So let me go ahead and, close this. Now what we have to do is we actually have to come to our console again. So let me undo the mess I've made, come to my console. So now we have this set of users, but we need to actually have some way to connect the rooms and the users and the messages. The way we can do this is we can generate a model. Let me full screen this and bump up the size. Say Rails G model. We'll call it a participant because a user participates in a room. The user also is a reference and a room is a reference. So for both of those, we'll say user::references, and then we'll say room::references. We can then run a Rails db::migrate command to migrate the database. And then we can unfull screen because I think we're done here. So let me run a Rails S again. Hopefully that doesn't blow everything up. I'll refresh. It seems fine. Let's now come into our models folder. And then let's go into our room.rb. Let me full screen this again because there's a bit more that we have to do in here. Now in here, we're currently saying that we are after create, commit, broadcast, append to rooms. But of course, now we have two different rooms, one if it is private and one if it isn't private. So if it is private, it's going to be a private room. If it's not private, it's going to be considered under the scope of the public rooms, which is what we're using in our controller. So let's change the after create commit first of all. And let's say we want to broadcast if public. So if we're creating a channel, we only want to broadcast it if it's public. Because if it's private, we already have the channel in the sense that it exists under this users list. If it's public, it's a new room that we're creating, which we don't already have here because it's not linked to an already existing model. So that's why we're only broadcasting if it's public. So let me full screen this. We also need to say that we has many participants, and we're going to say these are dependent destroy, because of course, if there's no room for you to be participating in. So now we have to say def broadcast if public. And then here we just want to broadcast append to. And then we'll just say we're going to append to rooms like we did before, unless this is private. Of course, we can check what this means when we're broadcasting to this appended room by coming into our views. we can come down to our rooms and our index, and we're just broadcasting to our turbo stream, which has our ID of users, which renders our list of users. I'm sorry, that's not true. We're broadcasting to the rooms. So the turbo stream for the rooms, which has the rooms being rendered right here. So that's all we're doing is we're broadcasting to this so that when we create a new room, which we'll call fifth wall, it's just added to the list of rooms. That's all that's doing. So let's come back into our room.rb because we're not quite done yet, because remember from our controller that we also had that create private room method. So if it's not public, we then need to say def self.create private room. And we're going to take in some users and a room name. Just close that off. And then we'll say single room is equal to room.create. Because remember, if we're in here, it means that we are trying to create this room. So of course, creating it means we have to create it. We'll give it a name of the room name that we created in our controller, where we have one user always before the other based on their IDs. And we'll say is private for this specific room is set to true because it's a private chat. Now, as GitHub Copilot is pointing out, we need to loop through our users here. And then for each of the two users, we want to say participant dot create. And we want to create a participant that has a user ID of this user.id and a room ID of the single room we just created.id. Once we've done that, we now have our participant created. So let's come into our message model because of course we have to also do something in here. And basically what we want to do in here is we want to say before create, we want to confirm that someone is a participant. So what does that mean? Well, it means we need a method first of all. So let me just type that out. But it means that we want to check if this is a private room. So if this .room is private, then we want to do something. And here we want to say is participant is equal to participant .where the user ID is self.user.id and the room ID is self.room.id. And then after that, we want to just grab the first one, I believe. Dot first. And then if this isn't the case, we'll just, based on the blog post that I'm referencing, we'll say throw abort unless is participant. Oops. If I save this, I should get an error, maybe. No? Yeah, there it is. And it's going to tell us that we should use a guard clause instead, which just means that we should do a return unless. So instead of having an if statement, it prefers if we say return unless room.is private, I think is what it wants. If I save this, so that takes care of creating the message logic. I think we already handled the styling. So if we come into our rooms and our index page, we should have the user email or the single room being displayed from the last episode. So bold claim here, but if I did this correctly, and I'm just going to restart the server just to be safe, I might now be able to message John, but it looks like I can't because I've messed something up. Okay, so I think I figured out what the issue is. If I come over here, so our at single room doesn't have a method here. I think if we come into our room.rb model here, we actually need to return the single room after we're done inside of this self.create private room. If we refresh now, it looks like I can message John. So I'll say, hey, John. And there is the hey, John message. So let's open up a new tab. Over to here, and we'll just say localhost port 3000, log in, john@doe.com with a password, start chatting, come over to Dean, there's the hey John, and I'll just say, I'm busy, what do you want? be like, I don't know, I saw your post in general, LOL. And that looks like it's working as far as the direct messages go. So in a future episode, we can cover some of the stuff we saw in the Electron, like the user avatars and the timestamps, and of course, Electron itself and some more stuff. But if you do have any suggestions, feel free to leave them in comments down below, and I'll try and look into it. Right now, I'm trying to figure out if I can do calls and screen sharing and stuff like that, but I'm running into some issues with Rails 7 and the import maps. So if you do have any suggestions, feel free to leave them down below, and I will see you in part 3.